Okay, so for everyone out there studying hard for the MCAT, I know, there's a lot to cover.
Oh, yeah.
But we're diving into a section today that's super important for the exam, and I think even more important for when you actually, become doctors.
Absolutely.
It's the whole psychology, sociology, and biological basis of behavior section. And specifically, we're going to untangle this knot of prejudice, bias, and discrimination. Like what they are, how they work, why they matter so much.
Yeah. These are concepts that, honestly, everyone should have a good grasp of, but especially for future positions. You're going to be interacting with people from all walks of life, and understanding these dynamics is crucial for providing really good care.
Exactly. Like, it goes way beyond just checking boxes on a test. This is about, like, the core of how we see each other, how we treat each other.
Right.
And I think how society itself can kind of create these systems that sometimes make things harder for some folks than others.
Yeah, and how those systems can really impact health and well-being. It's all connected.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly do we mean when we say prejudice? It feels like a word that gets tossed around a lot, but what's at the heart of it?
Well, yeah, right. It is used a lot. But at its core, prejudice is a negative attitude.
Okay.
Like a negative feeling you have toward a specific group of people.
Got it.
And you lump all the individuals in that group together, based on whatever characteristic they share.
Like race, gender, religion.
Yeah, exactly. Those are some big ones. But it could be anything, really. Sexual orientation, age, even things like profession or where someone went to college.
Interesting. So it's not just like a personal dislike.
No, it's deeper than that.
Like you said, it's an attitude.
Right. It's rooted in this idea that entire group, just by being that group, is somehow less than or bad or dangerous.
So is it like mainly an emotional thing?
Well, it definitely starts with emotions a lot of the time.
Okay.
Fear, anger, disgust. Those are some powerful drivers.
I can see that.
Like, if you think about it, prejudice often comes from a place of feeling threatened or uncomfortable with things that are different from what we're used to.
Makes sense.
But then it gets even more complicated because our brains try to make sense of those feelings, and they love to simplify things.
Right, our brains love shortcuts.
Exactly. So that's where stereotypes come in.
Oh, okay.
Stereotypes are those oversimplified beliefs we hold about entire groups, like all teenagers are lazy, or all women are emotional.
Or all lawyers are.
Yeah, you get the idea.
Yeah, we've all heard those. But I guess the thing is, even if they seem harmless, they're not really, are they?
No, they're not, because they reduce individuals to these flat, one-dimensional characters based on their group membership.
Right, and they ignore all the individual differences within that group.
Exactly.
So it's like we're taking all these complex human beings and just shoving them into these little boxes.
Yeah, and those boxes can become really limiting, both for the people inside them and for how we interact with them.
So we've got the emotions driving the prejudice, and then stereotypes kind of popping up as a way to explain it. But you also mentioned something about how society itself can, like, make prejudice into its structures.
Yeah, that's a crucial piece of this, because it's not just about what's going on in our individual heads.
Right.
Prejudice can become embedded in the very institutions and systems that shape our lives. It's like it becomes woven into the fabric of society.
Okay, I'm listening. How does that happen?
Well, societies aren't usually totally equal, right? There are power imbalances.
Yeah, definitely.
Some groups have more power, more resources, more prestige than others. And guess what? Those dominant groups often develop and perpetuate prejudices that help to justify why things are the way they are.
Oh, interesting.
It's like, by seeing marginalized groups as somehow inferior, less deserving, or even threatening, the dominant group can make it seem okay that they have more and others have less.
It's like a way to rationalize inequality, to make it feel natural or inevitable.
Exactly. And then those justifications filter down through society. They get reinforced by laws, by media, by education, by just the way things are done.
So it's not just about, like, one person being mean to another person.
No, it's much bigger than that.
It's about how the whole system can be tilted in favor of some groups and against others.
Right. And it's about how even well-intentioned people can end up participating in those systems without even realizing it.
That's kind of scary, honestly.
It is. But by becoming aware of these dynamics, we can start to challenge them and work towards creating a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about prejudice as this internal attitude and how it can get tied up with stereotypes and how those attitudes can become, like, built into the systems we live in. But how does that actually play out in the real world? Right. How do we go from those internal feelings to actually treating people differently?
That's where discrimination comes in.
Okay.
Discrimination is the action part of prejudice. It's when those negative attitudes lead to unequal treatment.
So it's the difference between thinking something about someone
Yeah,
and actually acting on those thoughts in a way that hurts them or disadvantages them.
exactly. Like, let's say you have a landlord who believes, based on stereotypes, that people of a certain race are messy tenants.
Okay.
That's prejudice, right? But if that landlord then refuses to rent to someone of that race,
That's discrimination.
that's discrimination. It's
Yeah.
taking that prejudice belief and turning it into an action that has real consequences for the other person.
Right. That makes it really clear. So prejudice is what's happening in your head. Discrimination is what you actually do.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And those actions can range from like really big things to much smaller things.
Oh, absolutely. It can be as blatant as denying someone a job or a loan,
Right.
or it can be more subtle, like ignoring someone's ideas in a meeting.
Or giving someone worse service at a restaurant.
Exactly. Those smaller acts, sometimes called microaggressions, can really add up and take a toll on people over time.
And I imagine those are often harder to call out because they can feel so ambiguous.
Yeah, they can. But it's important to remember that even those smaller acts of discrimination can be incredibly hurtful and harmful.
Okay, before we go any further, I think it would be good to do a little quiz,
Oh, I like quizzes.
just to make sure everyone's following along.
Good idea.
All right, so here's a multiple choice question for you all. Which of these is not a core part of prejudice itself?
Okay.
A, negative emotion directed at a group.
Okay.
B, holding a stereotyped belief about a group.
All right.
C, engaging in unequal treatment of a group.
Mm-hmm.
Or D, categorizing individuals into social groups.
Okay. So which one is not a core part of prejudice itself?
Give everyone a second to think about it.
Take your time.
All right, the answer is C, engaging in unequal treatment of a group.
Yeah, that's discrimination, the action that stems from prejudice.
Exactly. Prejudice is all about the negative feelings, the stereotypes, and that initial act of putting people into categories.
Right. Which, by the way, is something our brains do naturally. It's how we make sense of the world. But prejudice takes that categorization and adds a value judgment, like this group is bad or this group is less than.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
And that's where the trouble really starts.
Got it. All right, so we've got a good foundation now on what prejudice is, how it's different from discrimination, and how stereotypes play a role.
Yeah.
Now, I want to dig a little deeper into how society, amplifies all of this.
Okay.
Like we talked about how prejudice can be baked into systems, but I'm curious about the specific ways that power, prestige, and class come into play.
Oh, yeah, those are huge factors.
Like how do those things actually contribute to prejudice?
Well, imagine a society where one group consistently holds more power, wealth, and social status than other groups.
Okay.
It happens all the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly it does.
What often happens is that the dominant group, the one with all the advantages, they start to see those advantages as proof that they're inherently better.
Oh, wow.
That they deserve to be on top. And to maintain that position, to justify the inequalities.
They develop prejudices.
Yeah, exactly. They create and cling to beliefs that paint other groups as less capable, less intelligent, less trustworthy, whatever it might be.
It's like a way to protect their privilege, to convince themselves that it's not just about power, but about some kind of inherent superiority.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking can be really insidious because it allows people to ignore the systemic factors that contribute to inequality.
Right. It makes it seem like it's just the natural order of things.
Yeah, and those beliefs then get reflected in how the dominant group treats other groups.
So they might be less likely to hire someone from a marginalized group.
Or they might give them less pay for the same work or steer them towards lower status jobs.
Or you deny them loans or housing opportunities or access to quality education.
Exactly. All these things contribute to keeping those marginalized groups in a subordinate position.
And the really messed up thing is, those actions then can create a feedback loop.
Oh, absolutely. Where the marginalized group ends up struggling more, which then reinforces the dominant group's prejudice.
It's like a vicious cycle that's really hard to break out of.
Yeah, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand these dynamics, to see how prejudice, power, and discrimination are all intertwined.
Okay, we've talked a lot about stereotypes, but I want to make sure we're all crystal clear on what they are and how they function.
Good idea. They're a key part of this whole puzzle.
So what exactly is a stereotype, and how is it different from just a regular generalization?
Well, all stereotypes are generalizations, but not all generalizations are stereotypes.
Okay, how so?
A stereotype is a belief about a group that's overly simplified, widely held, and often resistant to change, even when faced with contradictory evidence.
It becomes this fixed idea that people just accept as truth.
Exactly, and they often get passed down through generations, or they get reinforced by media portrayals, or even just casual conversations.
Yeah, you hear them everywhere.
Right, and the problem with stereotypes is that they erase individual differences.
Like you said before, they lump everyone into a category.
Exactly. And they assign the same characteristics to everyone in that category, regardless of whether those characteristics are actually true for each individual.
So it's like saying all men are aggressive.
Right.
Or all women are nurturing.
Or all people from a certain country are lazy or greedy or whatever.
Yeah, we've all heard those kinds of stereotypes.
And those beliefs can have really damaging consequences because they lead to prejudice and discrimination.
It's like you're prejudging someone based on their group membership instead of actually getting to know them as an individual.
Exactly. And that can prevent you from seeing their unique strengths, talents, and perspectives.
Okay, so we've got prejudice, we've got stereotypes. Now let's talk about stigma.
All right.
How does that fit into this whole picture?
Stigma is like a supercharged form of prejudice.
Okay.
It's not just about holding a negative belief about a group. It's about attaching a sense of shame, disgrace, or disapproval to that group.
It's like you're marking them as different in a really negative way.
Yeah, exactly. And that mark, that stigma, can lead to social exclusion, discrimination, and all sorts of negative consequences for the people who are stigmatized.
So what kinds of things can be stigmatized?
Oh, all sorts of things. It can be based on visible traits, like a physical disability or a skin condition.
Right.
Or it can be based on invisible traits, like a mental illness or a history of addiction.
So it's not just about what you look like. It's about any characteristic that society deems unacceptable or undesirable.
Exactly. And the really insidious thing about stigma is that it can become internalized.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that people who are stigmatized can start to believe the negative things that society says about them.
Wow.
They can feel ashamed of themselves, they can have low self-esteem, they can even withdraw from social situations because they're afraid of being judged or rejected.
So even if no one is actively discriminating against them, they're still carrying that burden of stigma.
Yeah, and that can be really heavy to carry. It can affect their mental health, their physical health, their relationships, their job prospects, pretty much every aspect of their lives.
That's really powerful. And it makes me think about how we as a society need to do a better job of challenging stigma and supporting people who are stigmatized.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their differences.
Okay, let's do another quick quiz to check our understanding.
All right, bring it on.
True or false? Stigma can negatively impact a person's mental health, even if they're not consciously aware of every single instance of being stigmatized.
That's a good one.
Think carefully.
It's about more than just the overt acts of discrimination.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm ready.
The answer is true.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because even if someone isn't constantly being reminded of their stigma, they can still internalize those negative messages from society.
Right. It can seep into their self-perception and affect how they see themselves and how they interact with the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. I want to talk about how we perceive and judge other cultures.
Ah, yes. That's a whole other layer of complexity.
So let's start with the concept of ethnocentrism.
Okay.
What is that all about?
Ethnocentrism is basically viewing the world through the very narrow lens of your own culture.
Okay.
It's like you're using your own cultural values and beliefs as the gold standard for judging everything and everyone else.
So it's like saying, my way is the right way and everyone else is wrong.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And it often leads to this sense of superiority, like my culture is better than your culture.
And that can obviously lead to a lot of misunderstandings and conflicts.
Oh, absolutely. Because different cultures have different values, different norms, different ways of doing things.
Right.
And if you're approaching those differences from an ethnocentric perspective, you're likely to see them as strange or backward or even threatening.
Can you give us an example of how ethnocentrism might play out in a real-world situation?
Sure. Let's say you're from a culture that values individualism and competition, and you travel to a culture that's more collectivist and emphasizes cooperation and harmony.
Interesting.
From an ethnocentric viewpoint, you might look at that collectivist culture and think, wow, these people are so dependent on each other. They have no sense of independence.
Right, it might feel stifling or restrictive.
Yeah, but what you're missing is that within their cultural context, that collectivism provides a sense of belonging, security, and mutual support.
It's just a different way of being in the world.
Exactly. And ethnocentrism prevents you from seeing the value in those differences.
So how do we combat ethnocentrism?
By embracing cultural relativism.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Cultural relativism is the idea that we should try to understand other cultures from their own perspective.
Not from our own biased viewpoint.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there are many different ways of being in the world, and that no single culture has a monopoly on truth or morality.
So instead of judging other cultures based on our own standards,
We try to see them through their own lens.
to understand the values, beliefs, and practices that shape their way of life.
Right, and to appreciate the diversity of human experience.
This seems especially important for future doctors who will be interacting with patients from all sorts of backgrounds.
Oh, it's absolutely essential. In healthcare, cultural sensitivity is crucial.
How so?
Well, for starters, different cultures might have different beliefs about health and illness, different practices around seeking treatment, different ways of communicating about their symptoms.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And if a doctor approaches a patient from an ethnocentric perspective, they're likely to miss important cues, misinterpret the patient's concerns, and potentially provide inappropriate or even harmful care.
So cultural relativism is about being open-minded, respectful, and willing to learn from other cultures.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone's experiences and perspectives are valid, even if they're different from our own.
And that's crucial for building trust and rapport with patients, which is essential for effective healthcare.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how these negative stereotypes we've been discussing can actually impact people's behavior in real time.
Right.
Like, how can the simple awareness of a stereotype, even if you don't consciously believe it, affect how you perform or act?
That's where stereotype threat comes in.
Okay, what is that exactly?
Stereotype threat is this phenomenon where people who are aware of negative stereotypes about their group actually end up performing worse in situations where that stereotype is relevant.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Like the pressure of not wanting to confirm the stereotype actually ends up making you more likely to confirm it.
Exactly. It's a really powerful example of how our thoughts and beliefs can influence our behavior, even when we're not aware of it.
Can you give us an example of how stereotype threat might work in a real-world setting?
Sure. Imagine a young woman who's about to take a math test.
Okay.
And right before the test, she overhears someone say something like, "Oh, girls are just naturally bad at math."
Even if she knows that's not true.
Even if she's a math whiz, just hearing that stereotype can trigger a sense of anxiety and self-doubt.
Because she doesn't want to prove the stereotype right.
Exactly. And that anxiety can then interfere with her ability to focus, to think clearly, to access her knowledge.
So she ends up doing worse on the test, not because she's not capable, but because of the psychological pressure of the stereotype.
Exactly. And the really crazy thing is, this has been shown to happen across all sorts of groups and situations.
Like if you're a minority student taking a standardized test.
Or an older person trying to learn a new technology. Or even an athlete competing in a sport where their race or ethnicity is stereotyped.
So it's like these stereotypes create this extra hurdle for people to overcome.
Yeah, and it's a hurdle that's based on nothing more than prejudice and ignorance.
This brings us to the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies.
Oh yeah, those are fascinating.
How do those work and how are they related to stereotypes?
A self-fulfilling prophecy is basically when an expectation, whether positive or negative, leads to behaviors that actually make that expectation come true.
It's like the belief itself shapes the outcome.
Exactly. And this can happen in all sorts of ways, but let's stick with the stereotype example.
Okay.
Let's say a teacher has a stereotype that boys are better at math than girls.
Okay. Not a good stereotype to have.
Definitely not. But let's say the teacher has this belief, even subconsciously. What might happen is that the teacher, without even realizing it, starts treating the boys differently than the girls in math class.
Like giving them more attention, calling on them more often.
Yeah, or giving them more challenging problems to solve.
And as a result, the boys might actually end up performing better in math.
Exactly. Not because they're inherently better, but because the teacher's expectations created an environment that favored them.
So the stereotype becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, and the girls might start to believe that they're not good at math, which can further damage their confidence and performance.
It's like this vicious cycle that's really hard to break.
Yeah, and it shows how important it is for people in positions of power, like teachers, to be aware of their own biases and to make sure they're treating all students equitably.
Absolutely. Now, I want to connect this back to the world of healthcare.
Okay.
Because I think stereotype threat and self-fulfilling prophecies can have some pretty serious implications for how doctors interact with their patients.
Oh, without a doubt.
Like, how might these concepts play out in a medical setting?
Well, let's say a doctor has an unconscious bias that patients from a certain socioeconomic background are less likely to follow their treatment plan.
Okay.
That bias might lead the doctor to spend less time explaining the treatment to those patients, or to be less encouraging about their ability to stick with it.
And as a result, those patients might be less likely to adhere to the treatment.
Exactly, and that could then reinforce the doctor's initial bias, even though it was the doctor's behavior that contributed to the outcome.
So it's crucial for doctors to be aware of their own biases and to make sure they're treating all patients with respect and providing them with the same level of care.
Absolutely. And it's also important for doctors to be mindful of how their words and actions can influence their patients' beliefs and behaviors.
Right, because those beliefs and behaviors can have a real impact on their health outcomes.
Exactly. So it's not just about being a good person, it's about being a good doctor.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time talking about prejudice as this internal attitude and how it can manifest in subtle ways.
Yeah.
But I want to circle back to discrimination and really nail down the difference between individual and institutional discrimination.
Okay, good idea. It's an important distinction.
So remind us again, what is discrimination and how does it differ from prejudice?
Discrimination is the action part of prejudice.
Yeah.
It's when those negative attitudes towards a group lead to unequal or unfair treatment.
So it's the difference between thinking something about someone
Right.
and actually doing something to disadvantage them because of that thought.
Exactly. And there are two main types of discrimination: individual and institutional.
Okay, break those down for us.
Individual discrimination is pretty straightforward. It's when one person discriminates against another person.
So it's a one-on-one situation.
Yeah, like a store owner refusing to serve a customer because of their race.
Or a landlord refusing to rent to someone because of their religion?
Or an employer refusing to hire someone because of their gender.
Got it. So it's a specific act of discrimination by one individual against another.
Exactly. Now, institutional discrimination is a bit more complex.
Okay.
It's about how entire systems and institutions can be set up in ways that discriminate against certain groups.
So it's not just about one bad apple, it's about the whole barrel being rotten.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It's about how the rules, policies, and practices of an organization can create and perpetuate inequality, even if no one individual is intentionally discriminating.
Could you give us an example of institutional discrimination?
Sure. Think about the criminal justice system.
Okay.
Studies have shown that people of color are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and sentenced to harsher punishments than white people for the same offenses. Wow.
And that's not necessarily because every single police officer or judge is racist.
Right.
It's because the system itself is built on a foundation of racial bias, with things like racial profiling and mandatory minimum sentences that disproportionately impact communities of color.
So it's like the system is rigged against certain groups.
Exactly.
Yep.
And that can happen in any institution, from schools to workplaces to healthcare systems.
Can you give us an example of how institutional discrimination might manifest in healthcare?
Sure. Think about how medical research has historically focused primarily on white men.
Okay.
That means we have less data on how certain diseases and treatments affect women and people of color.
Yeah, that's a huge problem.
It is, and it can lead to misdiagnoses, ineffective treatments, and even worse health outcomes for those groups.
Because the system isn't taking their unique needs and experiences into account.
Exactly. And that's not always intentional. It's often a result of unconscious biases and historical inequalities that have been baked into the system. So it's like this hidden form of discrimination that can be really hard to spot and even harder to fix.
Yeah, but it's something we need to be constantly aware of and actively working to dismantle.
Okay, I think it's time for a recap.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
Let's make sure we've got all the key points straight.
Right.
So first, we talked about prejudice, which is that internal attitude, that negative feeling towards a group.
Often based on stereotypes, which are those oversimplified beliefs about entire groups.
Right, and we talked about how power, class, and prestige can really reinforce prejudice and make it a systemic issue, not just a personal one.
Exactly. And how those prejudices can lead to discrimination, which is the actual act of treating someone unfairly because of their group membership.
And we distinguish between individual discrimination, which is a one-on-one thing,
And institutional discrimination, which is about how entire systems can be biased against certain groups.
right? Then we dove into stigma, which is that extra layer of shame and disapproval that gets attached to certain traits or identities.
And we talked about how stigma can lead to social exclusion and all sorts of negative consequences for people who are stigmatized.
We also explored the difference between ethnocentrism, which is judging other cultures based on our own limited perspective.
And cultural relativism, which is about trying to understand other cultures from their own point of view.
And finally, we talked about how negative stereotypes can actually affect people's behavior through stereotype threat and self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yeah, it's amazing how these concepts all connect and influence each other.
It is. And for all of you future doctors out there, understanding these connections is so crucial.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just for passing the MCAT, but for being ethical, compassionate, and culturally competent physicians.
It's about recognizing that everyone deserves the same level of care, regardless of their background or identity.
Exactly. And it's about being aware of your own biases, so you can make sure you're not perpetuating prejudice or discrimination in your practice.
It's about being an advocate for your patients and working to create a more just and equitable healthcare system for everyone.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. It's been incredibly insightful.
My pleasure. It's a topic I'm very passionate about.
And for those of you listening, as you continue on your journey to becoming doctors, I want to leave you with this question.
Okay?
How can you use this knowledge to challenge prejudice, mitigate bias, and advocate for equitable care for all of your future patients?
That's a great question to ponder.
It's something to really think about as you navigate the complexities of medical education and, eventually, the real world of patient care.
Because at the end of the day, it's about using your knowledge and your power to make a positive difference in the lives of others.
Beautifully said. That's all the time we have for today, folks.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in.
Keep those brains working.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
All right. See you then.